Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 5th edition of the Institute of Supply Chain Management Supply Chain 101 series. For those who have attended this before, you are familiar with the Institute of Supply Chain Management. I would like to give you a small brief on the Institute of Supply Chain Management before we start. The Institute of Supply Chain Management was founded in 2014 as an eminent and focused institution on supply chain management, demand planning, and sourcing. Our focus areas were supply chain management, and as we go today, we will talk about why we consider sourcing as a part of supply chain management. There are issues in that. We will speak about it when we come to the main part of the session. The Institute was founded with a focus on education, research, consulting, mentoring, and everything to do with supply chain knowledge. So what we have is we have a whole range of offerings to the supply chain community, which includes education, certification, training. If any of you is interested in an in-company training, probably once the pandemic is over and we go back to what will be our new normal, I would request you to please pass on our credentials to your HR and learning and development team so that we could also be in touch with you for training through your company. We offer research and consulting in the areas of supply chain management. Some of these research result in white papers, which are generally published in our portal called SCM Pro Knowledge Portal, scmproknowledge.in. If you're interested, you could visit the SCM Pro Knowledge Portal and have a look at the reports that we have published, the interfaces or the interviews that we have published, the opinions of various eminent supply chain leaders that we have put up on the portal. It is free. Please go and register and start reading. And we also have SCM Pro forums where we do events, especially before COVID, we were focused on face-to-face meetings and roundtables, but post-COVID, we do a lot of webinars. If you could look at our website, SCM Pro forums, you would be hearing about the various webinars that we keep doing across India, Middle East, Egypt, Turkey. So we do it in multiple countries. So you could also have a look at what the kind of events that we do. Coming to education, we offer a 11-month executive program in supply chain management. This is a weekend program with classes held every weekend. 11-month with a 2-month project which you will have to do, so that the entire course is structured around what will be the requirements of the supply chain management in the new normal. So we look at the traditional forms of supply chain, the traditional structures of supply chain. We take it apart and then we put it back again to say, what is the kind of supply chain that we will need going forward? So the EPSCM is a virtual classroom event, will be available from the end of August. We have a certification for senior supply chain professionals. We call it R4, which is essentially reimagining the supply chain of the future. What we do in R4 is for over a period of 8 days spread across a month, we will give you what is it that you need to look for when you start orchestrating supply chains for the future. So apart from the ISCM faculty, you will have a range of industry speakers who will come and speak to us on various experience that they have and what are the kind of experiments that they are doing in R4. So it will be a theory and practical mix that you will have in R4, which will lead to the Certified Supply Chain Leader designation. The second batch is now being launched on 19th of September. The first batch is already on. It was launched on the 4th of July. Certified Supply Chain Manager, which is a certification which we offer for supply chain professionals who are 3 to 5 years, 0 to 5 years kind of experience. Here we use contemporary literature and create a conceptual framework for the supply chain managers so that they can use it for building a resilient and sustainable supply chain going forward. Because the two things that COVID has taught us and is putting a lot of pressure on supply chains is to be resilient, sustainable, and responsive. So we will be focusing on how can you build a responsive, resilient, sustainable supply chain at a cost which does not break the bank. So that is the focus of the CSCM. And we also offer a certification for demand planning and forecasting, which is a very niche certification. We call it the Certified Demand Planning and Forecasting Professional. Over a period of 6 days, we take you through the various phases of demand planning and forecasting, from understanding demand forecasting, then to getting into the methodologies of demand planning and forecasting. We talk about error, measurement of performance, bias, sales and operations planning. So this certification is an all-round certification for someone who is looking at building a career in demand planning and forecasting. Some important dates for you. CSCM starts on 25th July. If anyone of you is interested, please do let us know. In any case, after the session is over, we will be mailing you about the CSCM brochures. It's also available on your handout section. There are 5 handouts available. You can log in and download those handouts. CDPEP start date is on 14th August, EPSCM on 30th August, and R4 is on 19th September. These are important dates for you to remember. ISCM has got an advisory council led by Dr. John Gatorna, Dr. Rakesh Singh, Dr. Mahendra Singh, who was formerly executive director at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They have a supply chain lab. He was the executive director there before he started his own supply chain consulting firm. Kalpesh Pathak, who is the Vice President, Purchase and Supply Chain Management at Fiat Chrysler, which will now become Stellantis. And Dr. Rakesh Sinha, who is the CEO of Reflexive Supply Chain Solutions. He was earlier the CTO and Chief Operating Officer of Godrej Consumer Products Limited and heading the supply chain there. Our mentors, who are also the faculty who will be assisting us in all our endeavors. We have Dr. Rakesh Singh, we have me, Girish, you have Dr. Suhas Rane, Dr. Upadhyay, and Rajiv Sathe. These are all academicians. And the others from Shashank, Arif, Rahul, Rishi, Satish, Ravin, Ryan, Rakesh Sinha. These are practitioners who are associated with us to help us in delivering our courses. These are some of our clients to whom we have delivered our training programs. We hope to have some of your companies also on the list with your help. And our ecosystem consists of, apart from the Institute of Supply Chain Management, which is focused on education training, we have SCM Pro Knowledge, which is a knowledge portal I did talk to you about. We have SCM Pro Forums, which is more on conducting events and webinars, roundtables, discussions, etc. And we have a Demand Planning Academy, which is focused only on demand planning because we felt that it required a center of excellence to focus on demand planning. You can follow us on the Institute of Supply Chain Management on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube. In fact, you can go to YouTube and look at the ISCM SCM Pro. If you search for it, you will get all the videos of our events which we have posted there. You can even visit our event website, scmproforums.com, and our knowledge portal, SCM Pro Knowledge. So you could look at either, you could please do visit forums.com and scmpronowledge.in. That's a brief introduction to the Institute of Supply Chain Management, and I will now welcome you by switching you over to the topic of the day, which is sourcing decisions in supply chain. For all those who have joined late, my name is Girish, and I'm a director at the Institute of Supply Chain Management. I look after education and training. What are we going to do today? Today we are trying to look at the role of supply chain, of sourcing in a supply chain, and we also are going to look at some of the major decisions that people will be taking when we look at sourcing. Whether do I buy it or do I outsource it or do I make it? And there are some of the decisions also which will happen there. But first, I would like to talk to you about what is it. Before I start all that, also let me also remind you, in case you have any doubt or any clarification that you need to know, on your screens on your right hand side you have a panel where there is something called as questions, where my pointer now is. So if you click on the questions, you can write your questions, send it to us, and I will be addressing them as and when I am getting those questions. The only request I have, today's questions, please keep it focused on sourcing so that we could spend more time on sourcing. Yes, I have the first question. What's the difference between sourcing and procurement? Yes, there's a functional difference between sourcing and procurement. When I look at sourcing, my major job profile there is to understand, is to figure out where do I buy from, to identify a vendor, to check for their quality, to onboard them so that they become an approved vendor. So sourcing is more related to understanding whom do I buy from, while procurement is actually, once I get a request from a department, how do I go about buying the product as specified by my internal team. So somebody will be, my production team will be telling me I need this material, these are the specifications in which I may require it. The procurement function then takes it to the approved vendors, floats an RFP, a request for quotation, gets the quotation, or if it's already contracted, just issues a purchase order against which they deliver. While for sourcing, I will be looking at who can supply the material for me. There's that difference between sourcing and procurement as a function. Now, if I were to look at sourcing, traditionally, you all know that there is something called as a value chain. Value chain was first propounded by Michael Porter when he started talking about the first structured understanding of value chain. And in the value chain, he kept the factors of production, which will include your production, your supply chain, etc., which forms the core of the value chain. And he kept sourcing as a he kept it outside the main chain, but as a support function to the supply chain and the organization. So traditional value chain analysis looks at sourcing as not a part of the entire value chain, but something which will help the value chain. But today we are looking at sourcing as an integral part of supply chain itself, because today when we look at supply chains, the role is to reduce the total cost that we have in supply chains. So one of the biggest costs that you will figure out is in terms of sourcing. If you look at a manufacturing company's balance sheet, or you look at, for example, an automotive manufacturer, the last time I looked at the balance sheet of Mahindra and Mahindra, around 70% of their total spend is on material for manufacture. So they are buying this total spend. In fact, if they're spending 100 rupees, out of the 100 rupees, 70 rupees are spent by the sourcing division for buying material for the manufacture of cars. if you look at most companies, 60 to 70% is what this ratio will be. It will depend. Sometimes if you're a service organization, your sourcing will not be that high. Your largest item will on your balance sheet will be your salaries. So if you're a service company, it's slightly different from your manufacturing. But most manufacturing, sourcing is one of the largest expenses that they have. And therefore, they want to keep a complete control of it. And therefore, it is being now brought in as, now, if you are into a manufacturing company and 70% of your costs are through sourcing, and if you're trying to reduce cost, which is the area that you will first want to look at, your sourcing, right? It becomes a core area where you will want to focus on. So sourcing becomes a core area if you start looking at the company. And which is why today we are looking at sourcing as a part of the supply chain itself. Now, what is the role of sourcing in a supply chain? Here are some questions which I would like you to get a grip on before we start exploring sourcing in a bigger way. What are some of the ways that a firm can benefit from a good sourcing decision? Can any one of you type in your response and send it to me on that questions? So that we can make it interactive. Koshi, you have asked about how global sourcing will change after COVID. Also, is this chain in supply disappearing in future? Supply chain will not disappear. In fact, it will become stronger, but its global footprint might change. We will come to how global sourcing will change after COVID-19 towards the end of the presentation. I have a slide on that. Yes, Muthuraman said timely, clear decisions on make or buy. Yes, that is one of the decisions. Good sourcing will benefit in quality of goods and products by Ravi. Priya Jain says better demand fulfillment and higher customer satisfaction. Higher standards of material from vendor and time likely. Cost. Yes. The good sourcing, now there's a decision between a sourcing decision and a good sourcing decision. A good sourcing decision has to optimize your cost with the quality which is acceptable to your manufacturing. I always keep saying that quality is one thing that we will never put on the table when it comes to any decision, because it has to meet the quality. Without quality, you're not going to go there. So quality is non-negotiable, but given the price, what is the quality that you can expect? For example, if you're buying a Rolls Royce versus buying a Maruti, your expectation in quality will be different. So yes, cost, yes, it will be a cost. It will be ability to supply the requirements as and when you need it. So the way a firm benefits from a good sourcing decision is essentially by trying to get in goods and ensure that production is not stopped. That is their biggest function. How can a supplier with a lower price end up costing more than a supplier with a higher price? This is something that we need to realize. Price is not everything. In fact, then in my discussions with a lot of people in the supply chain, essentially in the logistics services space, we come up with this statement saying that every year we want to reduce the freight that we are paying the transporter, and therefore year on year we keep reducing the freight. With the result, the guy who is delivering trucks to you does not find it remunerative enough for him to supply trucks to you at the time you want. And therefore, it's a very common thing when you go negotiating, they'll say, sir, you just give me in half an hour's time, my truck will come and stand in front of your gate. But once you sign him up, because of the way you're beaten down prices, you will call him, you will get excuses rather than trucks. Now, you know what is this cost going to be? This cost is a hidden cost. Therefore, what will happen is the higher priced vendor will charge upfront from you, but will ensure quality and the timeliness of delivery. The lower cost vendor will say okay to you, and then when you want him, you will get an excuse. Which one do you prefer? The L1, which is the lower price, or the one who is more efficient? This is one of the deals that we are going to see, and this is one of the major learnings from the COVID also, that a reliable supplier at a slightly higher price is better than an unreliable supplier at a lower price. So reliability is what will differ rather than price going forward. Now, as a manufacturer, you will be buying components for manufacturing your raw materials, and then you'll also buy some things from the office like a paper, pen, staples, coffee, tea. These are also purchases which the procurement function does. How do we differentiate between these two? Now, when I'm talking about raw material procurement, we call this as direct spend, which is the money which the company is going to spend directly on the materials for production. The other part of spend is the indirect spend, which is not meant for the production, but for keeping all the other things like your ACs, your cars, your office equipments, your cubicles, everything else comes into indirect supplies. A lot of effort by companies is to ensure direct procurement is under control, while indirect procurement becomes a little bit of a case, because it's a case-to-case purchase. It is not that very high quality cost of purchase. Therefore, you tend to become a little lax there. For example, pens, papers, etc. We don't really get into a year-long contract. A lot of us don't get into it. Some of us do get into it also. Essentially, you look at a contract only if you have benefits of it. How will procurement affect your bottom line? That's one of the first things that we will need to look at when we look at sourcing. I'm just giving you an example here because I just took it from the balance sheets. Profit margin of Pfizer was 24% and Dell was 5%. Okay. And Boeing was 2.8%. More or less, it is still the same thing. Pharmaceutical companies have a much better margin than manufacturing companies. Now, if you reduce procurement cost by 1% of revenue, it would have increased your bottom line by, it would have gone directly to your bottom line. Any savings in procurement cost directly to the bottom line, right? So if you have to reduce your, if you reduce your procurement cost by 1% of the revenue to achieve the same impact of net profit, Pfizer would have to increase its revenue by 4.17%. Dell would have to increase their revenue by 20% and Boeing by 35.7%. This is where today when we look at sourcing, almost every sourcing person has carries a target with them. They have to deliver a certain amount of returns to the company. There's a targeted savings that procurement has to deliver. But when doing that, I want you to keep in mind that when you're doing that, never forget that your primary function is to ensure that your production keeps moving smoothly. What will happen? You will choose a vendor who is the lowest price, but whose reliability is not that good. So you will have to compensate for the unreliable vendor, you'll have to keep higher inventory, pushing up your inventory cost. You need to then look at vis-a-vis my inventory cost, is it better to give a little bit more to a better vendor and get it in time? So these are decisions that procurement guys need to keep taking on a regular basis. I would launch a small poll here. This is essentially for me also to understand how deeply involved we need to get. It's a poll on how many years of experience do you have. If you could just say around 30 seconds. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, 74% of you are at least 5 years and above experience. That's very good. And 21% are with 0 to 3 years of experience. Okay. One of the major takeaways of this slide is that if your profit margins are small, then you have to keep focused on reducing procurement cost. But when you're looking at procurement cost, I will come later on as to what should you look at and not just the purchase price. So that's something that we need to keep in mind, not the purchase price, but the total cost. So the primary objectives of my procurement function is to reduce the cost of goods and services, capture resultant savings. When I reduce cost, I get some savings. I also need to create alliances with my suppliers. This is one thing that has come up after COVID. People have realized that unless you build a relationship with your supplier, he is not going to stand by you. It's very easy for a supplier to put his hands up and say, "Sab, abhi to COVID hai, I can't do anything." But if you have a very good relationship with him, he might try to do something for you. So relationship is becoming much more important, and therefore people are trying to go beyond just the alliance or the contract to form a larger relationship with the company or a larger collaboration with the firm. At the same time, we need quality, ensure that the production never suffers. That's one of the biggest focus areas of a company, of the sourcing decision, never to let your production stop. At the same time, you also need to keep looking at your purchase process and try to see how much you can reduce it. Now, one of the things that I want to, for example, what I'm talking about total purchasing process, if somebody can let me know, if you're working, how much of, what is the cost of placing one purchase order by your company? What will be the cost of one purchase order by your company? Yes, Muthuraman, you did say, can zero rejection supplier with little more cost could be? Yes, a zero rejection is a very good. Yes, Rajendra Pawar said rupees 400 plus. Rajendra Pawar, what would be the components of this cost? $100. Koshi Samuel. Interesting. Okay, let me give you what was my experience. I did a small dipstick study in two organizations. One was a SME pharmaceutical manufacturer, and the other was an SME, what do you call it? Normal component manufacturer. Okay. Ravi Tejas says it is between 2,500 to 3,000. Rajendra Pawar says manpower, ERP cost, finance. Yes, when I looked at the pharmaceutical company, the cost of placing an order is 2,500 rupees per order. And for the other component manufacturer, it was around 1,500 rupees per. Okay, Koshi's rate is for the Koshi, by and large across the world, the cost of placing an order is plus $100 in any case. The reason being, it is not just the ERP cost or the manpower cost or things like that. Once you place the order, somebody has to receive the order, somebody has to inspect it, somebody has to do the quality testing of it, somebody has to approve it, then it has to be taken to your inventory. There's a whole host of other costs which add up to your total cost of placing a purchase order. So that is one of the reasons why we need to focus on the purchasing process. Do we have the right process? Therefore, if we have the right process, a good process can eliminate some of these costs. That is one of the decisions that you will need to keep learning as we go up. Right? What is the role of sourcing in a supply chain? I did talk to you about, when I talked to you about sourcing, it is figuring out who the supplier is and assessing it. Then selecting the right supplier, contract negotiation, talking to them about the quality of the product, the design parameters that you want, etc. Function of what you procured on an ongoing basis to understand, is the supplier whom you have chosen actually adding cost to you or reducing your cost? That's something that you will need to do. The more there are rejects, the more there are failures. Remember, for every reject or every failure, there is a cost that you have to bear. Had you been getting it without rejects, that is one thing, but there's going to be rejects and quality defects, you'll have to keep a higher inventory. Therefore, there is going to be a cost on that. So you'll need to keep this in mind. I would like to launch one more poll on your area of interest. So if you could just quickly focus on what are the areas of interest you have, that will be also good for us. Just 30 seconds. If you could kindly let us know what are your interests. Is it warehousing, transportation, supply chain, demand planning, whatever it is? Request you to please do that. I know there was some trouble. The poll was not showing. Trying to figure it out. Anyway, I'll see that later. There are a couple of questions which have come to me. Anshuman Chaudhary has asked, profitable rate for contracts. Yes, they can be made. Sumit Mirakar has said, will e-commerce boom after COVID-19? That's what people are saying, that e-commerce will be the future. How could AI change procurement models? To work smarter, better, faster in future. Koshi, just hold, Shikant, just hold on for a few minutes. I will get back to you. In my couple of slides, I have them. So what is it the sourcing ecosystem consists of? Getting the right specification, getting the right cost, managing your supplier, which is supplier relationship management, understanding how you're spending your money, buying it at the best price, and understanding what your business needs are. You need to knit all of them together to create a good sourcing function. And when I talk to you about cost, I'm not talking to you just about the purchase cost. The purchase cost is just the small part that you see as a tip of the iceberg. The most of the costs, which are actual costs of the purchase, are hidden from us, and therefore we need to look at all these costs when we start buying. For example, freight. How will freight change when I change suppliers? Will that make a substantial difference to me? Will my procurement practices increase my cost or reduce my cost? In fact, if I've got multiple tiers of inspection and quality assurance, my cost of procurement, if I go in for small batches, will be higher than when I go in for large batches. What are my inventory practices? What are my maintenance expenses? What are my quality costs? All these costs are part of your total cost, and therefore you need to keep looking at your total cost when you start looking at procurement. So procurement was a first total cost of ownership, and that was came from what do you call it, as capital equipment purchase. But today, any purchase is being looked at through the total cost angle. So people who are interested to know how will For people who are interested to know how will the post-COVID sourcing practices change, the first thing that we will do now going forward, and again this is mainly from the interactions that we have had with our supply chain and sourcing professionals from across the country over the last couple of months. This is what we have understood from speaking to them. Their first chance is to secure the supply base, which means earlier it was a transaction oriented approach which we are working, but today we are looking at building relationship and saying that if these are the products I need, which are the suppliers who can give it to me, who can give it to me on a regular basis, who can give it to me on an urgent basis, who can give it to me on a crunch timeline. So these are some of the things that securing a supply chain is one. Transparency of your supply is one of the biggest issues that you will have. You will need to focus on creating transparency across the entire chain, up and down, so that if you are anticipating a slowdown, if you are anticipating increase, slowdown or increase, your suppliers also need to immediately know it, because they also have to make arrangements down the line. Quite often your supplier will be capable, but probably his supplier will not be capable. So today you have to look at not only your supplier, but the supplier down the line, to understand how these supply chains can create transparency for your sourcing function. You also need to look at what is the inventory available to you. The COVID has changed one way. Companies which had just-in-time inventory faced a lot of problems, while companies which had inventory in stock were happy because they could keep the production lines running for a little bit more. So probably it's time for us to revisit whether just-in-time is going to be the way forward, or do we need to look at contingency plans for just-in-time. One of the biggest issues that you will also look at is your working capital. As I told you, up to 70% of the cost of a product is manufacturing cost, or 70% of the spend of a company is on sourcing. If that is so, it requires a huge amount of working capital to keep your function going, and therefore if you can have a better way of managing your working capital, reducing your working capital, that will improve your cash flow availability. Cash flow is becoming critical today, and today people are saying what we want is cash, and not to be left behind. You also need to be resilient enough for the future. In fact, what this means is that you will have to kind of create plan B, plan C. If supplier A fails, then go to supplier B. If he fails, go to supplier C. So you need to have more than one person in your list by which you can create resilience in your supply chain. And what is the future going to look like? We are going to be in an increasingly volatile but digitally transformed world. So if we are going to a digitally transformed world, where we will be needing to look at things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, to look at the whole series of data that we have built in so far. We have a huge amount of procurement data with us, including the costs, the delays, the problems, the supply constraints. So once we put all of them into using an AI engine, if we can look at our database, probably we'll be able to see some linkages which we have missed. So yes, there is a role for AI to play in sourcing decisions, which will essentially be coming from making sense of the vast data that is already available with us. Today, we do not use most of the data. In fact, a McKinsey study famously said that we use only 5% of the data that we collect. 95% of the data we do not use. Probably because we don't have the ability to churn that huge amount of data, but with big data and machine learning coming in, we will be able to use that data very well. The other issues that we could have, as I talked about, building deeper supplier relationship, that is something that people everywhere want to look at. and delivering value beyond savings. So one thing is to become cost conscious. The other thing is to look at value conscious. So there is going to be a shift from being cost conscious to value conscious. What is the value that I'm adding to my company is something that sourcing people will need to figure out. Now, I would like to launch the same poll, but since that poll was not doing well, I'm just launching it in a different avatar. The question is now, which area are you looking at? Supply chain, demand planning, warehousing. If you could just quickly fill in. Thank you. Okay, any questions so far? If you could ask if you have any questions, we could go into them. So Shashikant, essentially, how you would work going forward is once you have AI kind of once you have an artificial intelligence kind of solution, using the data, you will probably able to clearly understand how cost functions are changing across by various issues, various delays, etc., that are happening. And you will also be able to make sense of understanding what is the kind of best suppliers you could create. So that's one way that will be happening. How is volatility getting increased? I did not understand. Mridul, how is volatility increasing is very, very simple. What is happening today is that the consumer is very confused and not sure of what he wants to buy. The consumer demand is changing in a very dynamic way. When the consumer changes his demand, then there will be a problem with the orders which come to the factory. And therefore, the problem will then cascade down into the supply side of it, saying that if I'm not sure what I need to manufacture, what do I need to buy then? So this is increasing over a period of time, and especially after COVID, volatility has increased substantially. Products which people thought would not work, would not sell, were selling very well. For example, when I was talking to some people in Dubai, they were saying that one of the first things to get over in a mall was fitness equipments. Because you had more time at home, you wanted to get into fitness. So that is the way changes happen. Therefore, volatility increases. Umar Tariq, if a raw material is being used in more than one part of different customers, how do I allocate raw material to all parts? Is there a calculation for it? There is no calculation for it. This is based on what your production is. Based on what your production is, you'll have to give them. So that as and when they require it, you'll have to give. You cannot say that, okay, I will give it to one and not to the other. You'll have to meet everyone's requirement. Therefore, there should not be any formula which you will require. When there are limited suppliers for any product, then how do we plan the delivery, cost and quality, as there are chances of suppliers making a cartel and deciding on everything as a group? Ravi, this is very true. Ravi Tejas has asked this. Ravi, this is very true on most places. You will see that once you get into this kind of contracted spend management, people in that contract know who the other people are. Therefore, there can tend to cartelize and say that, okay, we will quote this figure because we are the 6 approved vendors in the list. We can then control that. It can happen, and which is why people are trying various things. But then again, in sourcing, we have something called as Kraljic matrix, which will essentially help you understand how core is your supplier to you as a function. For example, if I were to talk about car manufacturer, the most crucial element of a car are engine and transmission. They becomes very strategic, while your nuts and bolt become something which anyone can supply. Therefore, the engine transmission guys, you don't go on and you build relationships with them, collaborate with them, while with the nut and bolt, you look at the cheapest. These are the kind of differences that will come. What are companies doing about carbon footprint in their supply chains? In India, it is going to become required. It will be a requirement in the future, but as of date, we are seeing just the initial phases happening. Any other questions? I'll give you a few more seconds. If there is not, then I'll see you next time, which is the final session of the 101 series. How to research and evaluate suppliers against key criteria. Shashikant. Shashikant, there is no one single answer to this. What I would suggest is that nothing can replace a on-site visit by you. A lot of sourcing people need to travel towards corporates, to companies, their suppliers, to evaluate the actual state of the supplier. That is where you start getting insights into how and it should normally be an unannounced visit, because when you are announcing the visit, then everything can be kept very nice. So you do an unannounced visit and look at what how the supplier is easy, having systems, processes, because normally when you ask them to show, everyone can show you a document. So if you go there and look at it, you will see a different thing. So that is one of the way that you can do it. The other one is asking your competitors, how is a particular guy performing? One basic question by Shashikant again: how would you describe negotiation skills? Please substantiate. How would you describe your negotiation? I do not understand this question. How will I describe my negotiation skill or a company's negotiation? These are all things to be built up over a period of time. Negotiation is itself a serious factor. A lot of people need to go through courses for it. Most of Indian companies have pledged for not procuring from China. How do we plan for that? Ravi, Ravi has asked this question again. Replacing China is going to be a huge task for anyone in this sourcing domain, primarily because thanks to the cheap labor and capital arbitrage which China had, they built huge capacities. And once they built those huge capacities, the factories in other parts of the world faced problems and they lost markets, so they had to downgrade. Now suddenly you need to bring them back up. You will need a lot of investments going in, and the question is, how will we get that investment? From where will we get that investment? Who will make that investment? So once that investment part is clear, probably we'll be able to see how it changes. And in any case, a lot of suppliers were already moving away from China to Vietnam and other areas because of the high cost in China. China is no more a low cost. Their capital and labor costs are much higher. For information for most of you, the cost of the salary, average salary, or rather the per capita GDP income of China is 3 times India. It's close to $10,000, while India is somewhere around $3,000. Can you please repeat the portion on cost of manufacturing and sourcing? My internet got unstable. Currently, labor has moved. I'll do that. Currently, labor has moved to hometown, especially truck drivers, unloaders, etc. Supply chain manager. How can technology can help you in this by automating a lot of these processes? A lot of loading, unloading. Once you palletize material, the loading, unloading becomes through forklifts, which can be done faster rather than by a chain of people handling box after box. So loading, unloading can become very easy. There is nothing that can replace drivers now. So that's another function that will be there. What are KPIs in sourcing? Koshi, that's a big question, because there's a number of things that can affect sourcing. What I would primarily say is that you need to look at your sourcing in multiple buckets, and for each of them you need to develop a series of KPIs. For example, if it is going to be for your strategic purchases, which are core to your operations, without which you cannot run. For example, as I said, in case of auto manufacturer, it could be the engine and transmission. There the KPI is not going to be on price. It is going to be on innovations, what is the kind of reliability, quality. While if I were to look at nuts, bolts, washers, there the KPI would be how am I able to control costs. So it changes based on the nature of the product that you're buying and how relevant is it to you in terms of getting alternate suppliers. I'm not saying that a nut or a bolt which is there in a bill of material is not vital. Without that, it would not have been made. The bill of material, if it is in the bill of material, it is important. So you cannot, if anything is on a bill of material, it is vital for procurement. But if you have alternate sources, then you don't need to be your KPIs need to change based on that. How can a buyer lower expenses and monitor costs? Rajendra Pawar, you can't take care of a monopoly supplier. You have to build a collaboration with him. You have to get into his good books, and you have to treat him as such. At the same time, you need to go out and see if you can create an alternate supplier. Because if you have a design of the product, you own the design, then you can create another supplier. If you cannot, then you have that one monopoly supplier. You will have to live with it. I think my experience of how a buyer can lower expenses. Shashikant, I want you to take this back, saying that apart from lowering expenses, probably you need to look at reliability of your supplier. If your supplier is more reliable in terms of quality, delivery, your total cost will keep coming down rather than the purchase price. So therefore, you need to look at, when you start negotiation for a product, you need to create what is called as a shadow cost or a would-be cost. What is it that you think this product should cost? Once you have that idea with you, then you will be able to understand how the quote comes. You need to understand something of how the product is being manufactured so that you can have a understanding of the cost elements. So these are things which you need to understand before you can get into talking about reducing cost. Yeah. Thank you very much. Kilivalan Ramesh, can you give me a small explanation on the ongoing digital transformation? Kilivalan, that's a huge topic itself. Our next session would be on technology, so we will take it up there. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for waiting so patiently for this, and thank you for logging in. You will definitely hear from us. We will share with you some of this presentation. I definitely will share with you, and the recordings will also be available on our channel, so you could look at the channel. Thank you very much. Until next time, stay safe, keep safe.